Most people assume that lying only happens when someone has something to hide. But the reality is far more complex and far more human. Because people don't just lie to escape consequences, they lie to manage perception, regulate emotions, and protect their identity. And once you understand this, you start to realize that lying is not always about deception. It's often about survival in a social world where being judged, rejected, or misunderstood feels like a real threat. And this is why people lie even when they don't need to. Even when the truth would technically be easier, because the brain is not wired to prioritize truth. It's wired to prioritize safety, and safety in modern life often means maintaining a certain image in front of others. So when someone exaggerates a story, hides a mistake, or slightly bends the truth in a conversation, what they're really doing is protecting how they want to be seen. And this is deeply connected to a psychological concept known as cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension that arises when your actions don't match your self-image. Because if someone sees themselves as competent but makes a mistake, or sees themselves as kind but behaves selfishly, that internal conflict creates discomfort. And instead of updating their self-image, which is mentally expensive, the brain often chooses the easier path, which is to adjust the narrative. And that adjustment can take the form of a lie, not always a big obvious lie, but a small distortion that makes reality feel more aligned with identity. And this is why people often lie to themselves before they lie to others. Because if you can convince yourself of a version of the truth, it becomes much easier to present it externally without feeling like you're being dishonest. And another powerful driver of lying is social pressure, because humans are deeply wired to belong. And belonging often requires fitting into certain expectations, so people will say they agree when they don't, pretend to like something they don't enjoy, or hide parts of themselves that feel unacceptable, not because they're trying to manipulate others, but because they're trying to avoid rejection. And in that moment, the lie feels like a tool for connection, even though in the long run it can create distance. And this is also why people tell what are called prosocial lies, small untruths intended to protect someone else's feelings, like saying you like a gift you don't actually like, or telling someone they did a good job when you think they could have done better, because the brain weighs emotional impact more heavily than factual accuracy and chooses the option that preserves harmony. But beyond social pressure and identity protection, there's also the role of habit, because the more someone lies, especially in low-stakes situations, the easier it becomes. And research in behavioral psychology suggests that repeated dishonesty can desensitize the brain's emotional response, meaning the initial discomfort of lying fades over time, and what once felt wrong starts to feel normal. And this creates a feedback loop where small lies lead to bigger ones, not out of malicious intent, but because the psychological barrier has been lowered. And then there's the factor of control, because lying can give people a sense of control over how others perceive them and how situations unfold. And in a world that often feels unpredictable, that sense of control can be incredibly appealing. So even when there's no immediate need to lie, the possibility of shaping reality in your favor becomes tempting. And this is especially true in environments where image matters, like social media, professional settings, or dating, where people feel pressure to present a polished version of themselves. And over time, the line between authentic self and curated self can blur, making it harder to distinguish truth from performance. And this brings us to another important point, which is that lying is not always a conscious decision, because many lies happen automatically as quick, almost reflexive responses to avoid discomfort, like saying, "I'm fine," when you're not, or giving an excuse instead of admitting you forgot something. And these micro-lies are so common that they often go unnoticed, but they reveal how deeply ingrained this behavior is in everyday communication. And yet, despite how common lying is, humans are also remarkably good at detecting inconsistencies, not necessarily through specific cues like avoiding eye contact, which is often unreliable, but through a general sense of incongruence, when someone's words, tone, and behavior don't fully align. And this is why trust is so fragile, because once someone senses that disconnect, even subtly, it can change how they interpret everything else you say, and rebuilding that trust takes far more effort than maintaining it in the first place. So if lying is so natural, and sometimes even functional, what's the solution? And the answer is not to eliminate all forms of dishonesty, which is unrealistic, but to become aware of why you're lying in the first place. because awareness creates choice. And when you notice that you're about to bend the truth to protect your image, avoid discomfort, or gain control, you can pause and ask yourself what you're really trying to protect, and whether that protection is worth the long-term cost. Because often the thing you're trying to avoid, like a moment of embarrassment or vulnerability, is far less damaging than the erosion of trust that comes from repeated dishonesty. And learning to tolerate that discomfort, to say, I don't know, I made a mistake, or that's not something I agree with, is actually a sign of psychological strength, not weakness, because it shows that your sense of self is stable enough to handle imperfection. And interestingly, people tend to trust those who are willing to be imperfect more than those who appear flawless, because imperfection feels real, and real feels safe, and safe builds connection. So in the end, people lie not because they're inherently bad or deceptive, but because they're trying to navigate a complex social world with a brain that prioritizes safety, identity, and belonging over objective truth. And once you understand that, you can start to see lies not just as acts of dishonesty, but as signals of fear, insecurity, or unmet needs, both in others and in yourself. And that perspective doesn't excuse lying, but it does make it easier to respond with awareness rather than judgment. And when you combine that awareness with a commitment to clarity and authenticity, you create something far more powerful than a perfect image. You create trust. And once you understand the psychology behind why people lie, even when they don't need to, you start to see that the real skill is not in avoiding lies completely, but in building a version of yourself that no longer needs them.